Understanding consonance and dissonance in music is paramount for musical composition. However, nature of musical dissonance still remains unclear. Latest psychophysiological research suggests that dissonance is a complex phenomenon and identifies three major factors that constitute our perception of dissonance: spectral interference, harmonicity, and cultural familiarity. Let's take a closer look. Spectral interference theory assumes that consonance and dissonance perception is related to interference of harmonics of simultaneously sounding notes. When several notes are played together, the partials in their spectrums that are close experience beating. To get a better understanding of what beating is, let me use additive synthesizer from newtonality.net website. So here I have my instance loaded with the preset that can play two separate sine waves. So this spectrum view down bottom here has these two vertical lines, green one and the orange one. Those represent frequencies and amplitudes of two separate sine waves. So the green sine wave is static, and the orange one, the frequency of orange one, can be controlled using this slider here. So first of all, let's listen how it sounds if I make those frequencies the same. Sounds just normal single sine wave. But if I change the frequency of orange sine wave just tiny little bit, it will sound a bit different. Let's check this out. So rather than hearing two separate sine waves, we hear a single sine wave that is oscillating in amplitude. And this oscillation is called beating. The beating is really just a result of summation of two sine waves with different frequencies. And the more the frequency difference between those sine waves, the faster the beating is happening. So let's see how it sounds when I increase the frequency of orange sine wave. So as I was increasing the frequency, the beating started happening faster and faster and faster. And at some point, it started to sound very rough. So this roughness quality is what is considered to contribute to our perception of dissonance. In the real instruments, when we play a single note or interval or a complex chord, we have many sine waves playing at the same time. And the more of this roughness quality is happening between those sine waves, the more dissonant this sound is perceived. Because roughness is really connected to beating and beating is just a mathematical phenomena, we can calculate roughness, and in this synthesizer it is represented by these solid lines. And for sine wave, the roughness profile really looks like just the curve with one maximum, past which the roughness falls down and we start perceiving two separate sine waves rather than one rough sound. If you want to know more about this, you can check out some of my previous videos. I go into greater details explaining all of that stuff. One of indication of validity of that theory is the structure of our inner ear. It has a limited resolution when converting sound into spectrum and thus is sensible to beating. You can watch this video for more details. Additionally, spectral interference theory has a pretty good predicative force. It explains why some intervals and chords are more dissonant than others, and why same intervals in low registers sound more dissonant than in high registers. Also following that theory, we can arrive to cool applications for microtonal and experimental music. For example, we can make tunings other than 12-tone equal temperament sound much smoother, and thus make them more accessible for unprepared listener. And lastly, it is very helpful in analyzing tuning of instruments of non-Western cultures, such as Indonesian gamelan music, that cannot be approximated with 12-tone equal temperament at all. Let's now talk about periodicity and harmonicity theory. Very important type of sounds that exist in nature are harmonic sounds, or the sounds with harmonic spectrum. Their feature is that each partial is a whole number multiple of fundamental frequency. Such sounds are periodic in time. In other words, waveform consists of chunks that repeat indefinitely. Musical instruments, our voices, vocalizations of animals are all harmonic sounds. Periodicity and harmonicity theories focus on how close the sound is to harmonic spectrum, or in other words, how periodic is its waveform. That theory is very close to conventional notions about consonance and dissonance, like the ones that smaller ratios like 3:2 or perfect fifth sound more consonant than bigger ones like 9:8 or major second, because waveform of 3:2 interval has shorter period and is closer to harmonic template. The scientific reasoning behind this theory is that we evolved to detect harmonic sounds in our surroundings. as it increases our chances for survival. Our ear decomposes sound into spectrum, and the brain looks for harmonic patterns to find and extract useful sounds. Therefore, when we hear music, the brain detects harmonic content in it, and the closer it is to harmonic spectrum, the more pleasant it is perceived. Lastly, let's talk about cultural conditioning theories. We live in a certain cultural environment where we're exposed to certain types of music, so we learn to like what we hear, and that shapes our perception of consonance and dissonance. Some researchers point out that this is the main factor that determines our preference towards certain chords and intervals. At first, when I started to dive into all of this, I thought that spectral interference is the key to understand dissonance. And that realization was what made me start this channel. So if you watched any of my previous videos, you saw me providing a lot of evidence for why I think spectral interference is great in explaining dissonance. But now we have some competing theories, and let's see if we can put spectral interference theory to test. Headphones are required for this one. Because beating is the result of summation of sine waves, we should be able to mitigate beating if we play sounds separately in different ears while wearing headphones. This way sounds never really meet physically, right? So for this demonstration I'll be using Newtonality.net synthesizer. I will engage the second note and put it right here on the maximum of roughness. And the first time I will play both notes in both ears and then each note in separate ear. Let's hear it. Post a comment which one do you think sounds smoother. To me, definitely example number 2 sounds much smoother than the first one. However, I was still able to perceive dissonance. And I think this way we can conclude that dissonance is not characteristic of our ear, but of our brain. So let's explore a bit more. There's much more we can do with the Newtonality synthesizer. So for this demonstration, what I will do is I will carefully choose spectrums to minimize the dissonance of a dissonant interval. So to do that, I am engaging the second note. Let's just make it visible, those orange lines. I will set its spectrum to harmonic and reduce number of partials to 3. Now, if I set its ratio to an octave, to 2, and then I set the amplitude to 0.5, as you can see, the orange lines will completely coincide with the green lines, the green partials of the lower note, that we can actually disable here in Tweak panel. And therefore, now, 2 notes form the spectrum of just one note. They should be indistinguishable from each other. And you can actually do the same trick using just the subtractive synthesizer, just usual synthesizers. For the lower note, you should choose the square wave, and for the higher note, it should be octave up, and it should be a sawtooth wave. And then even if you just do a math yourself, you will see that playing those 2 sounds together will generate a sawtooth wave with a frequency of a square wave, of a lower note. This is just how it works out. So 2 notes become indistinguishable from just one note, which is kind of interesting for itself. But here, of course, we don't need to play an octave. We can deviate from this interval and see how it sounds and if we can perceive dissonance in that case or not. Let's hear it. Interesting. There's no closely aligned partials, but we still hear beating. However, if I just engage the missing partials of a lower note, you will hear that the beating is much smoother than with those partials present. So let me demonstrate that. Yeah, that's quite clear. And just for the final demonstration, if you're interested, we can also play this matched spectrums into different ears and compare how that sounds if they played in one ear or separate ears. So let's check this out. So again, playing in separate ears mitigate dissonance even more, but not completely. It is still present. So it seems like deviations from harmonic spectrum are perceived as dissonance. Though you can make a point that it's actually because we're getting closer to the lower note, and that's why it's not the same as it is in harmonic spectrum. So let me do a final demonstration. So this is just 6 partials of harmonic spectrum. I will play it, and then I will use this slider here to stretch the spectrum a little bit, so the partials actually further apart from each other. So they should beat less. So let's hear. Unexpectedly, but as soon as I start deviating from harmonic spectrum, I started to hear beats. Though mathematically speaking, they should happen, because the partials are further away from each other and therefore they should be more clearly perceived without any beats. But that is not the case. And I think this is happening because our brain just holds a harmonic pattern and compares everything that we hear with this harmonic pattern. And then when something deviates from it, we hear those phantom beats. And that really leads to interesting outcomes. Can we say that a single note can sound dissonant? Or should we treat it as a chord made of sine waves? Can music theory, conventional music theory, be applied for enharmonic sounds, or it just breaks down completely? That is all interesting questions that I leave out for now. But one thing that is apparent here is that the spectral interference is not the end of the story, and at least harmonicity is a very important contribution to our perception of dissonance. So let's see if we can find any support for that claim in the literature. The title of 2012 study, The Basis of Musical Consonants as Revealed by Cognitional Amusia, speaks for itself. Amusic individuals are impaired at detecting pitch deviations that are less than 2 semitones, leading for amusics to miss the essential part of musical structure. In this study, researchers tested different sound stimulus on a group of amusic individuals and control group subjects to try to see if there are any difference in dissonance perception, and if so, what is responsible for it. First thing that was demonstrated is that amusics do not have preference to one musical interval over the other in terms of pleasantness of a sound. They also cannot differentiate between harmonic or inharmonic sounds, as was shown by playing the same note with harmonic and inharmonic spectrum and asking if it was played with different instrument. They couldn't tell. But amusics showed the same preference for sounds without beats, and that led authors to conclude amusics exhibit the same normal aversion to beating, but lack the normal preference for consonance over dissonance, suggesting that consonance preferences do not derive from an aversion to beating. Rather, our results suggest that the quality of roughness induced by beating constitutes an aesthetic dimension that is distinct from that of dissonance. This conclusion is consistent with earlier work in normal listeners suggesting that harmonicity is more closely related to consonance than is beating. Now let's take a look how culture affects the way people perceive dissonance. Good cross-cultural study of perception of dissonance is done in the article Indifference to Dissonance in Native Amazonians Reveals Cultural Variation in Music Perception. The general idea of the study was to have several groups of people with different exposure to Western music, from North American musicians to inhabitants of remote Bolivian village that have no Western music experience at all, and some groups in between. Then play them a set of chords made of synthetic sounds, sound chords, harmonic and inharmonic tones, human vocalizations, and synthetic tones that magnify beating, and ask these different groups to rate those sounds by pleasantness. Here are results that show that the less exposure the people have to Western music, the less they discriminate between different chords or give preference to harmonic or inharmonic sounds, as well as sounds with or without beating. Authors conclude, rather than being an inevitable consequence of auditory system biology, it seems that the preference exhibited by Western listeners for harmonic frequencies arise from exposure to Western music, because the musical structures prevalent therein tend to produce harmonic frequencies. And although an aversion to roughness is apparently present cross-culturally, it seems to be unrelated to consonance and dissonance, perhaps because musical sounds in practice are not very rough. Those are solid arguments against spectral interference. However, I want to note that in both articles, they reported aversion to beating in their test subjects. And I also don't want to disregard the spectral interference theory, because I heard it with my own ears and I demonstrated in previous videos that it does seem to work. So let me demonstrate it one more time. For this one, I will play Clair de Lune 4 times, and I will use Newtonality.net synthesizer to generate samples. For the first example, I will generate normal harmonic spectrum with some partials missing just to make it a bit more interesting, and I will play it in a regular 12-tone equal temperament. So there should be no surprises there. For the second example, I will use this slider to stretch spectrum so that the partials of a sound are further apart than in harmonic spectrum. But I will still play it in 12th tone equal temperament. And spectral interference theory predicts that that should sound pretty dissonant because the partials won't align in 12th tone equal temperament because it is not a related tuning for this stretched spectrum. And for third example, I will mitigate exactly that. I will stretch the tuning so that the partials will align together. And for the fourth example, I will play normal harmonic spectrum from the first example, but in this stretched tuning. So let's hear it. To me, it is pretty obvious that the first example wins. It is the most consonant sounding and the most pleasant, I would say. However, the third example, I think, sounds much more musical than examples 2 and 4, which is exactly in accordance with spectral interference theory. But what if we look at those examples from harmonicity and cultural familiarity standpoints? Then again, example number 1 should win. But then example number 3 should be the most dissonant of all 4, because it has unfamiliar tuning, unfamiliar spectrum, and the spectrum is inharmonic. But it is not the case, at least for me. For me, it seems like the lack of beating trumps both inharmonicity and unfamiliarity. So what could be on your mind right now is that could all 3 contributions play a role at the same time? According to 2019 study Simultaneous Consonants in Music Perception and Composition, it is indeed the case that all 3 theories, periodicity, interference, and culture, play a major role in our perception of dissonance. To show it, authors made a brilliant literature review of 23 different models of dissonance, categorized them into 3 already familiar groups, harmonicity, interference, culture, and then evaluated them on the extensive corpus of music pieces that was comprised of classical, jazz, and popular compositions. Authors rank different models on how well their predictions correlated with average consonance ratings while controlling the number of notes in the chords, and got the following result. First, we see that top 3 places are taken by models from different theories. The first one is spectral interference model, the second is periodicity, and third is cultural conditioning. We also see that variation between models is more prominent than between theories. All that indicates that all 3 theories play an important role in our perception of dissonance. Next, authors construct a composite model that combines all 3 theories into one linear regression model and test it against the dataset. Such composite model shows better correlation with consonance ratings than individual contributions. Following pictures show regression coefficients for each model that show how much each mechanism contributes to the consonants for this dataset to get the prediction. We see that the best predictive force has interference theory, then goes harmonicity, followed by cultural conditioning. Authors also tested the composite model on dataset of compositions sorted by genres, classical, jazz, and popular. Interesting result is that coefficients vary depending on the genre of music. Like for jazz and popular music, the periodicity contribution was much weaker than for classical. So it seems like there is no one-fit-all and explains everything type of theory of dissonance. However, there are objective factors that we can take into account when composing music or building new musical instruments. The most prevalent contribution to dissonance seemed to be spectral interference. It is recognized by people cross-culturally and even by music individuals. Usually it has strong negative effect on consonants The more roughness, the more dissonance. But there are cultures that instead enjoy effect of roughness and actively pursue it in their music. Periodicity seems to be second most important predictor of consonance and dissonance. The closer the sound is to harmonic spectrum, or the more periodic it is, the more consonant people perceive it. That is very true for classical Western music, but can vary a lot with genre and culture. And the third predictor is culture. Firstly, we like what we used to hear in the past. Secondly, culture shapes a lot of who we are and how we should perceive things. And thirdly, I think we shouldn't forget about our own unique experiences and character as individuals. What we desire, our expertise, and even mood also shape our perception. Thank you for watching. Check out links in the description if you want to know more. Also, if you're interested in playing within harmonic sounds, check out the newtonality.net website. It has in-browser additive synthesizer, which allows you to tweak frequencies of individual partials and shows relation of spectrum to tuning. As always, like, share, subscribe, and I see you next time.